acupuncture, and naturopathy in personalized programs that help you take charge of your own health. A minimum 5-day stay is recommended for best results. Book now at WION.com.
This week on Inside South Asia, history created in Ayodhya as the Ram Mandir is consecrated, celebrations and fervour across South Asia and the world. Countdown to national elections in Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif frontrunner, but big challenges stare. Bhutan's famed Gross National Happiness Index in focus. A new documentary studies the ups and the downside. All this and much more on Inside South Asia.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Vikram Chandra and you're watching This World, the show where we bring you the week's biggest stories from around this world. And we have a lot to talk about today, including the nearly certain probability that it is going to be Donald Trump who's going to be the Republican candidate in this year's American presidential election. And it's virtually certain it could be Joe Biden on the other side, which means we have a rematch, Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. We have experts and strategists from both sides, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, joining us on this show to tell us what they think could possibly happen to derail such a rematch. And if there is to be a rematch, what should we expect from it? So that's coming up on this program. We also take a look at the latest tensions in the Middle East, including airstrikes on the Houthis. What implication is this going to have? And finally, we have a very interesting story to track for you, the possibility of a split in the Indian tectonic plate. All of that coming up on the show for you today. This week made one thing crystal clear. A Trump versus Biden rematch is increasingly becoming likely. In fact, it's virtually certain as of this moment. Former American President Donald Trump won big in the Republican presidential nominations by winning the primaries at New Hampshire, and this was his second victory. He's already won the primary in Iowa. In New Hampshire, Trump had gone up against the former UN ambassador and presidential hopeful Nikki Haley. Trump won, but the Indian-American Nikki Haley, who was America's ambassador to the UN under Trump, said the race is far from over. In other words, she's not leaving the race just yet, much to Trump's disappointment. In Iowa, Haley had finished third. In New Hampshire, she suffered a double-digit loss to Trump. But Haley does have big hopes from the next primary because it is in South Carolina, her home state, a state that she was once the governor of. Polls show that she's trailing Trump in South Carolina as well. So if you look at it, the road to the Republican nomination is all but clear for Trump. If Nikki Haley loses in South Carolina, it's quite possible, if not probable, that she may actually just call it a day, which means Trump becomes the nominee. Remember, other candidates have already pulled out. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who was considered Trump's biggest competitor, has already dropped out of the presidential bid, as in fact did Vivek Ramaswamy. Not just that, DeSantis has actually endorsed Trump. So that's why Trump seems very clear, as do most people, that the presidential nomination race for the Republican Party candidate is all but over.
You know, we won New Hampshire 3 times now. Three. We win it every time. We win the primary, we win the generals, we've won it, and it's a very, very special place to me. It's very important.
So the big question for us, what is going to happen next? Let's remember the one big elephant in the room. Trump is facing 91 criminal charges. They range from seeking to overturn the 2020 presidential elections to giving hush money payment to a porn star. Well, legally, a convict cannot be barred from contesting in an American election. But what you do have is at least 2 states who disqualified Trump from the primaries. I'm talking about Maine and I'm talking about Colorado. In a first, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution was cited by a Colorado court to ban Trump. What does this section say? It says, if any person who was previously elected to office has taken part in an insurrection or a rebellion, he or she cannot hold office again. Now that's a hiccup for Trump. While it's just those 2 states, it's a hiccup. If it becomes wider than that, it could become a serious problem. So that brings us to the key question. And it's a question we're going to be discussing and debating at great length for the rest of this year. What happens in a Donald Trump versus Joe Biden rematch? Biden, by the way, has made one thing very clear last year. He said he is contesting only because Donald Trump is. He does not so much want to win the election as he wants to defeat Trump. But the problem here is, and the interesting question here is, if that's what he really wants, then the polls don't favor Biden. Let me show you. The Economist YouGov poll asked participants to predict the outcome of a Trump versus Biden rematch. This irrespective of their personal preferences. 44% of the respondents said that Trump will win. 35% predicted a victory for Biden, 21% were unsure. In New Hampshire, Biden did not even appear on a ballot when it comes to the primary for the Democrat candidate. He won the primary in a write-in effort. So what if, seeing as Trump emerge as the Republican candidate, Democrats are forced to rethink their candidate? Well, for more on all of this, we're now being joined by Corinne Clark, who's a Republican strategist, the co-founder of freepressfail.com, and Nicole Brenner-Schmidt's also joining us, who's a strategist on the Democratic side. Corinne, if I can just start with you. Would it be fair to say it's now almost certain that it's going to be Donald Trump as the Republican presidential candidate come November?
It certainly looks that way. It would take a really big something for that to not be the case. I think the only one who is clinging to the hope that it won't be Donald Trump is Nikki Haley, and I don't see her lasting much longer.
You're essentially saying that Nikki Haley is still clinging to hope of some sort or the other, but if she doesn't win in South Carolina, then does that mean that that's that?
Well, it will be that no matter what, even if she stays in the race. I think the delegate count will be so much in the favor of Trump that she won't be able to win it at convention. I do think what she is trying to do is stay in the race as long as she can, gather as many delegates to try to make an argument to be in the Trump administration when he wins his election. So I think she knows she's not going to be president, but she's still trying to get whatever she can get out of this race.
Okay, before I shift to the Democrat side, Corinne, one more question to you. On the Republican side, what could be the other lightning strike scenario that could mean that Trump is not actually on the ticket? Let's say, for example, what if he's convicted? Let's say the legal cases go ahead, he's put on trial, he's convicted. Would he then continue to just fight on, contest from prison, or what would happen then?
I think the Trump campaign has been very clear that he will continue to run for president regardless of how these court cases work out. And I think that he has the support to do that. I think those cases are all falling apart before our eyes. I know the Georgia case this week has just taken such a turn. I think they'll have to drop that case entirely. So I don't see him actually being convicted. But if that was the case, I think he would only solidify the support who sees these cases as persecution of the American voter. And I think it'll only help him as is if that were to go forward.
All right, Nicole, let me just shift to the Democrat side. Is there any scenario under which you can see that Joe Biden is not the candidate from the Democratic side?
No, I don't see that happening. I don't think that Joe Biden would make that decision. I don't think that the Democratic Party would force him to do that either. This is an incumbent sitting president. They're going to continue to run this race. They're going to lean into the fact that, while Trump is almost certainly capturing the nomination of the Republican Party, that independents continue to be frustrated It's who went to Nikki Haley in New Hampshire, and they're going to work on solidifying their base and trying to convince independents and the same voters that in 2020 voted for Joe Biden to reelect him.
I hear you, but let's face it, we've seen many polls that are indicating that if there was to be an election tomorrow, especially in certain key swing battleground states, Trump would beat Biden. So if those polls continue and remain the way they are right now, is there any scenario in which Joe Biden himself says, no, I don't want to contest. All I wanted to do was to beat Trump. And if I can't do it, maybe somebody else should.
I mean, I think behind the scenes, there's some speculation about names, but there's no serious conversation or movement to it. It's much more looking beyond this cycle and seeing what is the Democratic future? What are we looking at in 2028? Who's sort of up and coming within those realms? I don't think that it'll be a given that it moves to Kamala Harris if Joe Biden is to win again this fall. There's a lot of different people in the party that they're looking to, but all made it very clear they weren't going to make a real solid effort to mount anything other than Congressman Dean Phillips, who is fighting his fight right now for all that it's worth, I guess.
Grant, if I could just ask you, why is it that Donald Trump has such a hold on the Republican Party? Why is it that no one's being able to challenge him, no matter how strong a chance they might think they had? No one can challenge Trump.
Well, Trump is undeniably the most successful Republican nominee that we have ever had in history. He has just blown every other candidate out of the water. And I think it's because he approaches his campaign so different than we've seen a candidate approach from the Republican side since maybe Ronald Reagan. And that is that he doesn't adopt a media narrative. He doesn't really play by the rules. And he gives everyone the feeling that he is fighting for them. I certainly feel that way myself. And it connects with voters that the Republicans had lost for the last few decades because we had been represented by a lot of Washington, D.C. elites. And Trump offered an alternative kind of voice. He made our party bigger than it ever has been before. And there's no reason for us to run away from that success. And as we can see, it really scares DC, and they're doing everything they can do to try to get him out of the race. But that only heightens the support on the grassroots level all across the country.
All right. Thank you both so much for joining us. Battle lines clearly seem to be getting drawn. Let's see how it all plays out. We'll, of course, keep tracking this very closely in the months ahead. All right, let's turn our attention now to West Asia. This week, the United States and the United Kingdom once again struck Houthi targets in Yemen. 8 targets were hit. The US says the strikes hit underground weapon storage sites of the Houthis. Bombs were also dropped on the Houthis' missile and surveillance capabilities. All in all, missile systems, launchers, air defense systems, radar, storage facilities were all apparently hit. This happened late on Monday night. On Tuesday morning, the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak told Parliament, and I'm quoting here, "Our initial evidence from last night's strikes is that all intended targets were destroyed," unquote. The British and the American forces also had help from Australia, from Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands. But in a statement put out by the US Central Command, the US allies made it clear that the strikes are, quote, "separate and distinct from the multinational freedom of navigation actions performed under Operation Prosperity Guardian." So some more details on those attacks. British jets used precision-guided bombs. They struck multiple location targets near Sana'a. The British Ministry of Defense released this footage. It shows fighter jets taking off from an airfield. We're being told this is Akriti in Cyprus. These jets went on to bomb Houthi targets in Yemen. Just to quickly remind all of you, who are the Houthis? Well, they're a militant group and they control the most populous parts of Yemen. Ever since the war in Gaza began, the Houthis have begun attacking ships in the Red Sea in solidarity with Hamas. They have, of course, already declared war on Israel. The US is trying to weaken the Houthis with these military strikes, only to get in exchange a promise of revenge from that battle-hardened group.
These strikes do not scare us and will not turn a hair on our heads. We are steadfast and support Palestine from within our hearts.
The US airstrikes are like a spray of water for a thirsty person. I swear it will not scare us or turn a hair on our heads. They will see nothing from us but a burning fire and flames, angry and hateful hearts.
And as airstrikes are continuing on Wednesday morning, the Americans struck targets in Yemen once again. The strikes began around 2:30 a.m. local time. This time we were told that missile stocks were hit. The American bombings were not limited to the Houthis of Yemen, by the way. On Wednesday, America also struck targets in Iraq. It said it was targeting sites being used by Iran-backed armed groups in Iraq. Jurf al-Shakr in the south of the capital, Baghdad, was hit, as was the area of Al-Qaim on the border with Syria. Now, how is Iraq reacting to all of this? Well, the country's National Security Advisor, Qasem al-Araji, said that the strikes did not help bring calm. So should you expect militant groups to strike back? I don't see why not. Quite frankly, it's a volatile situation in West Asia as Israel continues its war in Gaza. It's not clear what the solution possibly can be. Earlier this week, the Financial Times reported that the US has asked China to urge Iran to rein in Houthi rebels. Will Beijing oblige, and will Iran even listen to any of that? What's the way forward? Doesn't seem very clear. And for more on this, we're now being joined by Dr. Hassan Al-Hassan, who's a research fellow for Middle East policy at the IISS. He's decade of experience as a scholar and a practitioner of foreign policy. He was also served on His Royal Highness the Crown Prince of Bahrain's staff as a senior analyst on foreign policy and national security. Dr. Al-Hassan, thank you so much for being with us. Just wanted to get your sense of what's actually playing itself out, especially in Yemen and especially with the Houthis.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's good to be with you. Well, in a sense, we've seen a round of escalation and counter-escalation. And so the Houthis initially started out by linking their interdiction and disruption of maritime traffic in the Red Sea as an effort meant to dissuade Israel from continuing its destructive and bloody military campaign in Gaza. The US has responded by creating Operation Prosperity Guardian, leading it essentially creating a coalition of nations with almost no regional representation whatsoever beyond Bahrain. And that has spiraled to multiple direct confrontations where the Houthis have attempted to target certain US naval vessels, and the US and British forces have responded with multiple rounds of strikes. However, it's, I think, clear that it will be very difficult simply with limited airstrikes to totally degrade the Houthis' capabilities to continue disrupting maritime traffic. The Houthis have endured multiple years of being bombed from the air during the war with the Saudi-led coalition. And so they're quite used to concealing their capabilities. Much of their military capabilities are compact and agile, can be concealed. And so it's, in a sense, the US is going to be caught in a cat and mouse chase where it will need very dynamic intelligence that is able to essentially preempt Houthi attacks on short notice. So it's not an easy game, and the Houthis, I think, will not be deterred very easily.
So if airstrikes you think are not going to do it, then what are the alternatives? Either you let the Houthis be, or if at some point some sort of ground operations or a ground offensive in Yemen is going to be called for, and that has its own repercussions, what will be the stance you think of the Gulf states this time around? What will be the reactions of Saudi Arabia? How does it tie up with Iran?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the United States has viewed this purely through a military lens, and I think that's very short-sighted and ineffective. What the Houthis are, in fact, and by extension Iran, are doing is exploiting what they see as a strategic opportunity afforded to them by Israel's very destructive and bloody military campaign in Gaza to achieve political and ideological gains. And I think that's the logic that the US has not been able to deal with very effectively. The point being here, the bottom line, And this explains also why there has been no regional support, except for Bahrain, for those British and American strikes on the Houthis, even though there is little sympathy for the Houthis among the Arab states. Ultimately, the political route, I think, is viewed in the region as being the most effective and de-escalatory option, in the sense that if the US wants to achieve a region-wide de-escalation, not just the Red Sea, but including in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, where Iran-partnered militias are conducting attacks on US military interests there, then the best way to do that is by weighing on Israel and the Israeli government and pushing them towards a ceasefire. That would knock the political and ideological wind out of much of what the Houthis are doing in the Red Sea and what Iran's other partnered militias are doing.
Ceasefire in Gaza is the one point that you're making, and obviously a lot of effort is there. Assuming that doesn't work, is there something else that can be done? Some other way of talking to the Houthis or to the Iranians, for that matter, or is that unlikely now?
Well, that seems unlikely at the moment, because, as I said, this is an inflection point in the region. We've seen Iran make strategic gains by essentially changing the rules of engagement. They've managed, through their partnership with the Houthis, to open up a new front against the US and against Israel, and that is the Red Sea, in a way that has repercussions potentially for regional, but also for the global economy. And so this is a strategic gain for Iran that it has been able to claim for itself without really paying much of a price directly. And so I don't see why, short of a real change in the way Israel is currently prosecuting its objectives in Gaza, I don't see why Iran and how Iran will be made to change its calculus without, of course, a massive US military investment, which I don't think there is much political will in the US to do, not least during an election year.
All right, Dr. Al-Hassan, that sounds rather gloomy, but probably realistic. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And finally, before we wrap this week's show, there's a fascinating / borderline scary / somewhat speculative right now story that I don't want to share with you all. But earlier this week, we came across a report that said the Indian tectonic plate was breaking into two. That sounds rather terrible. It sounds rather scary, if you ask me. The Indian tectonic plate breaking into two. What does that mean for those who are living on this tectonic plate? What about those who have their houses built on this tectonic plate? What sort of a future should they be preparing for? The story begins anywhere between 35 to 55 million years ago. Two continental plates, the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate, began colliding. When two plates collide, the denser one usually slides beneath the other. That phenomenon is called subduction. But in the case of the Indian and the Eurasian plate, both had a similar density. So what happened? Eventually, the Eurasian plate was thrust skyward. That was the only way the pressure from the collision could be relieved. And that is how the Himalayas were formed. That's the result. Indian plate hits the Eurasian plate, and the pressure forces, the Eurasian plate to move up, Himalayas come up. That's what we know so far. Now let's come back to the tectonic plates. While the Eurasian plate was being thrust skyward, parts of the Indian plate slid beneath it. But because of the plate's density, it did not plunge into the Earth's mantle. Instead, this plate stuck to the belly of the Eurasian plate. Over the years, the Indian plate underwent what's being called delamination. Now, what is delamination? It means it began splitting into layers. The denser part of the plate began peeling away from the rest and from the Indian plate. This part began moving further towards the mantle. Think of it as a tree branch. Part of the branch splits and starts pointing downwards towards the ground, inside the ground. Part of it stays where it is or starts to go up. The result essentially is a tear, and that's what's being spoken about. Now, scientists are saying that they have found some evidence of this tear. They've studied earthquake waves, and they found that the Indian plate is tearing under Tibet. Yeah, the Indian plate does extend into Tibet. Quick point to be noted, the study is yet to be peer-reviewed. So don't run around panicking just yet. Nothing in any case is going to happen for millions of years, if not billions of years, but it's an interesting point which we're going to continue to keep a close eye on. And as more and more details of this come up, we will report it for you right here on This World. But that's all we have for you on this particular episode of the program. That's our show for this week. We'll see you very soon with a fresh lineup. My name is Vikram Chandra, and you're watching This World on WION World is One.